Hello. Today I'd like to talk about the history of life on Earth. I'm out here with Doobie. You want to say hi, Doobie? She's a little tired. She's been hiking a good amount today, and she just wants to be carried now. So I'm gonna carry her back to the car, and I'll tell the story of life on Earth. Well, it's quite an interesting story. It begins 4 billion years ago. Now, the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. That's a really long time. Humans have only been around for 0.0003 billion years. 300,000 years, which is way less than 4.5 billion. 4.5 billion is 4,500 million. And 300,000 is only a fraction of 1 million. So, Earth has been around a really long time. Well, we've been around a good amount of time too, but not compared to the Earth. Well, the early Earth, when the Earth was born, that's called the Hadeon. There are 4 eons, demarcated by changes in the Earth. Well, the first eon is from 4.5 billion to about 4 billion years ago. And that's when the Earth formed from a cloud of dust and rocks, meteors, comets, asteroids. They came together under gravity, circling the sun in an orbit, and formed the Earth. But the Earth looked very different then. If we could time travel back to then, we wouldn't be able to breathe the atmosphere. And it was very hot too. Lots of molten rock. During that time, the Earth's atmosphere was orange. It wasn't a blue planet like it is now. It didn't have oxygen. It had nitrogen like it does now, but a lot of methane and hydrogen and water vapor and CO2. All those gases kept the planet warm, despite the sun only being 70% as bright as it is now. So even though there was less sun intensity, the planet did not freeze over. It had a liquid ocean over the vast majority of the planet because there wasn't continents back then. It was literally just water over the Earth's crust. The Earth's crust was very thin because the mantle, the magma underneath, the molten rock was so hot. It kept the Earth's crust very flat. During that time, the planets were establishing their orbits, and there were a lot of rocks impacting the Earth. A large one impacted the Earth, and a huge chunk of the Earth got separated from itself and formed the moon. That happened during the Hadeon. But also during the Hadeon, something curious appeared. Life. The last universal common ancestor that we know of appeared during this time. Hello. Approximately 4 billion years ago, it was the first cell using DNA. Now, there would have been life before that. It's thought that the porous rock with the chemistries that were in the atmosphere and in the oceans allowed for RNA. RNA is kind of like DNA. They interface with each other, but allowed RNA to form strands and replicate itself. That would have been the precursor to cellular life. But the first cells seem to have come into existence 4 billion years ago in the Hadeon. What made them happen? Was it just random chance? Did they hitch a ride on a comet from another galaxy? We don't know. But they started 4 billion years ago. The last universal common ancestor of all life on Earth. Everything that you see in this camera view and underneath the ground, everything, birds, trees, shrubs, berries, this doggy, me, you, the fungi, the bacteria, the archaea. That's a type of microbe that's not a bacteria or a eukaryote. Eukaryote is like what we are. We have cells with nuclei in them. But archaea don't have nuclei, but they're different than bacteria. In fact, much of early life was archaea. They're able to survive in extreme environments, extreme cold, extreme hot, acids. We have archaea living inside our gut. They help us. Well, much of life back then was single-cell organisms. And as the planet started to age, we entered the second eon, which is called the Archean. That runs from 4 billion years ago to about 2.5 billion years ago. During that time, well, continents started to form, the crust started to thicken, oceans also started to deepen, but there were some areas of land. There were some shallow areas. The different bacteria, archaea, life forms, these very early cells, they had all kinds of different cells, a very big diversity. It was still an orange sky back then, toxic to us. But some bacteria, cyanobacteria, figured out that they could harness the energy of the sun by doing photosynthesis, taking sunlight and fixing the CO2 in the atmosphere into energy, carbon energy. And as a byproduct, they released oxygen. Now, oxygen was toxic back then to those life forms, but some of the bacteria, cyanobacteria, kept pumping it out because they were making energy from the sun. But the other bacteria, they couldn't handle it, so they died. And the cyanobacteria and other bacteria that were like, hey, that's a pretty good idea, we should do that too. Well, they kept growing and growing and growing and filled the sky with oxygen. Now there's less methane, there's less CO2, which also means there's less of a warming blanket. So there were periods of ice ball Earths where the whole Earth was covered in ice. This is likely some of the first mass extinctions. Well, there were likely mass extinctions during the time when the very early life forms were bombarded with rocks from space, the ones that created the moon. And there were likely mass extinctions then. But there were mass extinctions due to oxygen being injected into the atmosphere by life forms, killing off a lot of other life forms. At that time, oxygen was a pollutant. We don't think of it that way now because we breathe oxygen, you and I. But back then, it could have been viewed as a pollutant. Well, that demarcates the Archean eon with the Proterozoic eon, which runs from 2.5 billion years to about 500 billion years, half a billion years ago. So 2.5 billion years to half a billion. It's a long eon. that begins with oxygen changing the atmosphere, an orange planet changing into a blue planet, and life forms trying to figure out how to survive in this new environment. You have a bunch of archaea and bacteria who are used to living in an anaerobic, which means without oxygen, environment, and now it's toxic to them. Some of them strike a deal with other organisms who can use the oxygen. In fact, they strike a deal where they merge together in symbiosis. You get eukaryotes with mitochondria. Mitochondria used to be separate. They have their own RNA that's different than, say, like human DNA and RNA. But they struck a deal and they said, well, we'll live inside you and we'll be able to give you energy from the oxygen if you protect us. Same thing with chloroplasts. They were harnessing energy from the sun. The green that you see in leaves, those are chloroplasts, harnessing energy from the sunlight. And they said, well, if you let us live inside you, we'll give you energy if you give us a safe environment. And so they got engulfed by other bacteria and archaea to form eukaryotes of the plant variety, like these plants here. This is the Proterozoic Eon. Let's see, what else happened during that time? Well, some cells decided to clump together. We know this because there are fossils that you can find of bacterial mats, multicellular mats of just life forms clumped together. You can find some of them still in existence in Australia, among other places, but you can find the fossils of them that are dated to way back during this time. So some of them started to clump together and form a superorganism of multiple cells. You get multicellular organisms starting to form at the very end of the Proterozoic time, the Eon, which ushers in the current Eon, the Phanerozoic time. That means visible life. That's where you get multicellular organisms, animals, plants, birds, insects, fish, lizards. But they didn't all happen at once. It's actually very interesting. It started out as like sea sponges and shells, or mollusks, bivalves. Those are like clams and oysters and things like that. And then you start getting animals with appendages, like fish-like things. And during that time, the continents are forming, and you get some life forms with appendages crawling onto the land. That is 390 million years ago. No, 290 million years ago. I think that's correct. 290 million years ago. Now, some of them decide, well, it's a lot less crowded on land than it is in the ocean. There's a lot less scary predators in the ocean. Maybe we just spend all our time on land and we lay our eggs on land too. You get the first reptiles walking on land their whole life, 250 million years ago. Well, from there you get all of these other creatures. Tetrapods. We have 4 limbs. Doobie has 4 limbs. There are a lot of other creatures that have 4 limbs. There's insects that have 6 or 8. But you get all of these different life forms showing up, all descended from that last universal common ancestor. One of these branches in the tree of life. Now that is, I would say, is more like a web of life, because there's crossover between the branches. It's not like a tree branch where once it separates from the tree trunk, it just separates more and more and more. It doesn't have any crossover. Like the joining of the mitochondria and chloroplasts with other cells to create eukaryotes. That's cells with nuclei and other membrane-bound organelles. There is a interplay of the branches of life. It is a web instead of just a tree. One of the interesting webs is whales and dolphins, because their ancestors had crawled onto land and were living on land. They had developed lungs, like we have lungs. But then they spent a lot of time next to the water. And eventually, their descendants decided, the water is actually pretty great, and we got this really good way of hunting our food with using sound, echolocation, so maybe we should just spend all our time in water. So that's an interesting part of the web of life, where their ancestors decided that it was better to live on land, and then later they decided, maybe it's actually better to live in water now that we're different, we're changed. Time changed us, and now we go back into the ocean. And that's why dolphins and whales are more like us than they are fish. Their tails are flat, not up and down, vertical. They're horizontal. They have lungs. They have blowholes where they have to surface and breathe air like we do. They lay their eggs inside the mommy, and a little mini adult is born. That's a mammal. Instead of laying fish eggs, where fish hatch from the eggs that are outside the mommy. It's a very, very curious part of the web of deciding to go back into the ocean. Well, that brings us to, I guess I skipped the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs are in this Phanerozoic time, and there's some interesting mass extinctions during this time. Now, I've already talked about the oxygen changing the atmosphere and causing mass extinctions, but during the Phanerozoic, that's the current eon, that's been going on for half a billion years, there's been 6 mass extinctions. The 6th one is ongoing, is caused by us. But it's interesting to learn about a couple other mass extinctions. One was the one that wiped out all non-flying dinosaurs. There was an asteroid that hit near the Yucatan Peninsula in what's now called Gulf of America, formerly known as Gulf of Mexico. And that asteroid wiped out pretty much all living life forms that weighed more than 10 kilograms, which is about 23 pounds. If your adult weighed more than 23 pounds, you're dead. You died. Because the asteroid hit and blocked out the sun and wiped out all these plants and animals. But small ones survived. Our ancestors came from those small mammals that survived, turned into apes. And then the hominids, and then us at 0.3 million years ago. There was another mass extinction where 97% of life was wiped out. That was actually before the dinosaurs. It was at the boundary of the Permian and Triassic time. And there was an interesting article that was just published in Nature Communications about a super greenhouse effect that happened and why it persisted so long during that time. And that's actually what got me learning about all these things, these stories of life on Earth, and how there's actually been many mass extinctions, like countless, innumerable ones. We are causing one, but there are other life forms that have caused other ones too, like the oxygen crisis. Well, what started me on this path was this Nature Communications paper. I'll put the link in the description, of trying to figure out why the Earth was so hot at the mass extinction that wiped out 97% of life on Earth at the end of the Permian time period, 250 million years ago, or 0.25 billion years ago. What happened was there was a massive amount of volcanoes in what's now Siberia that erupted, and they kept erupting for 2 million years, a long time. They injected CO2, nitrogen, sulfate into the air. Well, sulfate cooled the Earth, the ash cooled the Earth temporarily, but the CO2 that was released into the atmosphere from the volcanoes and the volcanoes starting fires of coal, there was lots of coal, it was formed in prior periods from plants, decomposed plant matter that had turned to coal, rock, and were ignited by these eruptions. All of this CO2 and methane went into the atmosphere and warmed the planet drastically, really fast, but not as fast as we're warming the planet. We're actually warming it faster than that. But this was one of the fastest times back then. And what happened was really fascinating. These scientists were able to look at fossil records all around the world and date them and figure out that much of the forest disappeared because it became too hot for the trees to survive. The trees died. They probably burned. Trees like where I'm standing. Pretty much all the forests from 30 to 40 degrees latitude from the equator, which the United States, the northern border with Canada, is around 45-ish. If you imagine from the northern border of the United States down to somewhere below Brazil, maybe Argentina, we're talking about all the middle latitudes from 30-ish to 45-ish on the south and all the way up to the north. Pretty much all the forests disappeared because it was too hot. The CO2 trapped the heat, converted the sunlight into heat and trapped it. And the Earth became super, super, super hot for a long time. The forests went away. There were some forests that survived up in the Arctic areas, where we would today would be like northern Canada, Scandinavia, Russia, Siberia, and then on the south end it would be Antarctica and Patagonia. Some forests and plants survived there. Some animals survived where the forest survived. A lot of life died, 97%, including most animals in the equator areas, because that became desert. Now bacteria like archaea survived because they actually formed when the Earth was really hot and with a lot of CO2 and methane. So it was actually becoming more to their liking. So they survived, but a lot of animals died. And it stayed really hot for millions of years because the forests had died, and the forests were soaking up the carbon and cooling the Earth. They were taking the CO2 out of the sky and incorporating it in their bodies and leaves and roots, berries and seeds. But the forest died and released that. And it stayed hot for millions of years. But eventually, after millions of years, the forests in the north and the very far south regrew and sequestered the CO2 in their bodies. And the temperature started to go back down to a more normal level. And that's when you get the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous periods of dinosaurs. So dinosaurs came from descendants that made it through that bottleneck of that mass extinction. Well, those are the stories that I learned about the last couple days, and I thought they were really fascinating. I think it reframes things for me, because we are an organism that is causing a sixth mass extinction. It very well may be the most severe mass extinction, even worse than the end Permian Triassic mass extinction that wiped out 97% of life on Earth, because we are injecting CO2 into the atmosphere faster than the volcanoes did from the Siberian traps. If we continue, which we likely will, burning all the fossil fuels that we can get our hands on, we will probably wipe out the vast majority of life on Earth, likely including ourselves. I used to find that very distressing, and I mean it is still distressing, but I'm less distressed about it when I think about the kind of the big picture, zoomed out view that this has happened many times on Earth. There have been times like the Great Oxygen Crisis, where some life forms decided to pollute the atmosphere with oxygen, which was highly toxic to all the other life forms back then, and wiped out lots of life as they knew it at that time. But life goes on. And life will go on this Earth, with or without human beings. And I find actually some peace in that that's just what some life forms do. Well, those are my thoughts about the life on planet Earth, and I found it very helpful to learn about the different eons that people talk about. The Hadean, the Hadean eon, the Archean eon, the Proterozoic, which means before visible life, but that's actually not true, because there was visible life during that time, and the Archean and the Hadean, because life started way back then. From what? Who knows? And then it was interesting to hear about the 6 mass extinctions that mark the current era eon, the Phanerozoic, which means visible life. But again, life was visible earlier than 500 million years ago when the Phanerozoic begins. Well, I found all those things very fascinating. I also found it very fascinating that life forms combine together in a symbiosis to form eukaryotes that have mitochondria or chloroplasts. Like we have mitochondria, plants have chloroplasts as energy generators. It was a choice that our ancestors made. And I find it really interesting to think that different cells could come together and become one organism. Like the human body has about, I think, 1 billion cells, and that's not including the microbiome, which is not human cells. They're bacteria and archaea, and some viruses, some fungi. They actually outnumber human cells 10 to 1. They live in our gut mainly, but in different places of our body, like our skin. Mainly our gut, though. If you count them, we have 11 billion cells that form each human. But we are conscious of ourselves as a single organism, not 11 billion different cells just happening to work together. So I find that fascinating. My GoPro shut off. What I was saying was, I was wondering if our individual cells are conscious as individual entities, and they know that they're working together with the other cells, and then our experience of being a human is a conglomeration of all of these individual consciousness of individual cells. I really am very curious about that. Like, what is being human? What is this experience of our consciousness? Where does it come from? Is it actually a conglomeration of billions of experiences? Wow. Life is very interesting. Life is very fascinating. And the story of life is punctuated with life and death. But there is an unbroken chain of life from that last universal common ancestor, Luca, L-U-C-A, last universal common ancestor, to everything that's alive. All of this. Well, I think some of those stories can give us insight into what life will be like. As we burn our fossil fuels, we're changing the atmosphere faster than the Siberian traps did. I think a lot of life forms will die, including us, and probably dogs too, and most of these trees. But something new will come, like the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs, they sprung up from the ashes of the last greatest dying off, from the end Permian to the Triassic period. So life will go on in some way or another. There will be an unbroken line of life. But we may not be in that unbroken line. We may be a dead end on the web of life. Or we may not. Our descendants may continue. I don't know. Well, I think that's what makes things fascinating. That's what keeps things interesting in life. Well, those are my thoughts on the history of life on Earth. All right, girl, let's go home. Let's go get some food. Bye.